Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome to a new Let's Talk Lore series titled Military Ranks and Titles. And this is a very special series that was requested by many of you who had asked me to do a more detailed look at the rank and title system that was first introduced in patch 1.5. And although I've already done a patch breakdown over the new titles, that was a really brief overview. So here we're going to have a short special lore series where we will look at the different tiers of general titles that apply to the military, and then eventually we'll break down to how the Han military was structured. I'm sure this is something a lot of you guys are interested, so let's get started. First off, we have to provide some sort of frame of reference, and we're going to use the civil officers in the Imperial Court, which we talked about when the Mandate of Heaven was launched and the Imperial Court system was overhauled. And we see that there is the Sangong Jiuqin system, which is the 3 excellency positions and the 9 minister positions that kind of runs the Imperial Court. Now this is the bureaucrat side, or the civil side of the Imperial Court. If we look at the picture here, you can see the emperor presiding over his court, and very clearly you see the officials divided in half. On the left side, you have these officials dressed in this pale color robe, and on the right side, you have these officials dressed in red colored robes. And this kind of division is signifying the division of the civil and the military officials in the court. So for example here, we can divide the court in half, and on the left side, we can assume that they are the civil side, and they will be what was called Wenguan. And on the right side, you had the military officers, and these would be called Wuguan. And this isn't such a clear-cut black and white thing as it's showing this picture, which is more romanticized. You obviously had generals who qualified for both sides. You know, they could be a Wenguan and a Wuguan, and capable of being a minister during the peaceful time as well as a general during the wartime. So it's not such a black and white divide as you see here in the picture, but we're going to basically focus only on the military aspect for this series, so let's ignore the civil side for now. We'll only use the civil side kind of as a reference point to how highly ranked these military officers are. So in general, during the later Han periods into the Three Kingdoms period, the court system ran in 6 tiers. And these tier structures are called pin in Chinese, and you have tier 1 or yi pin. Yi means first, and pin means a tier. So you have basically first tier, second tier, third tier, fourth tier, fifth tier, sixth tier, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pin. And the lower the tier number, the higher tier you are. So tier 1 is the highest, tier 6 is the lowest, and we're going to run through the military ranks that belong to each of these tiers, starting with tier 1 and tier 2 in this episode. So way on the top, you have tier 1 or Yipin, and here there is only one title that's applied to this tier, and that's the title of the Grand General or Da Jiangjun. So in reference to the entire court, this title will be ranked even higher than the 3 Grand Excellency positions, including the Grand Commandant, who is technically in charge of the entire military operations. And this position is not always filled. So during most peaceful times, you don't have a Grand General in the court. If there is a war that occurs, the Emperor could name someone to be the Grand General. And there is no sort of regulations on how many men this position controls. This is just the Grand Commander of the whole military operation. So they control however big the army is. They're the top brass. No one's ranked above them except for Emperor, and they have full charge of what's happening on the battlefield. And some of the more famous characters that held this position during this Three Kingdoms period would be Cao Cao, Sima Yi, and Xiahou Dun. Now, you might notice all 3 of these generals are from Wei, and there's a reason for that, because Cao Cao, who held this title for the longest time, was the de facto regent and ruler of the later Han dynasties as he held the young emperor hostage. So basically whatever he said was made into law. Therefore, since Liu Bei and Sun Quan were still technically officials of the Han dynasty, and just regional warlords in this chaotic time, they can't go about naming their own generals grand generals because they can only be named by the emperor. But since the emperor is under the control of Cao Cao, Cao Cao named himself as the grand general. And later on, when Cao Cao became the Duke of Wei and kind of really did away with a lot of the emperor's command, this position was passed down to Xiahou Dun and later on Sima Yi. So this is why all the grand generals from this Three Kingdoms period come from the kingdom Wei. And Liu Bei and Sun Quan doesn't have anyone in this title because they felt wrong to name anyone to this title since they were not emperors themselves. So moving on to tier 2, where things start get a little confusing, we have 3 sub-tiers within this second tier. So on the top, you have 3 generals titled General of the Cavalry, General of the Chariot, and General who Protects. So General of the Cavalry and Chariots is a title that is in game, but technically it should be 2 different titles. General of the Cavalry is technically second in command in terms of rank. Only the Grand General is ranked above this position, and this position is also not always filled. And sometimes when there's a war or a situation, the emperor might not name a Grand General. He might just name a General of the Cavalry, and this will still be the highest ranking position in the court. The only difference between these 2 positions is that the Grand General is ranked above the 3 Grand Excellency positions, but the General of the Cavalry, General of the Chariot, and General who Protects are equal to the rank of the Grand Excellency position. So it's kind of just a balance between the civil and military side that offers the biggest difference here. Now, you could also have a Grand General and a General of the Cavalry both in existence at the same time, and then the Grand General obviously would have a higher rank. And one rank below the General of the Cavalry is the General of the Chariot, and below that is the General who Protects. Now, there are some fine differences between these 3 positions, and we'll go into detail about how these positions are different once we talk about each one in depth. But first, below this sub-tier, you have another sub-tier called 4 Generals Who Conquers. And this is 4 Generals Who Conquers because it correlates to the 4 cardinal directions. So technically, these 4 positions are General who conquers the north, General who conquers the south, General who conquers the west, and General who conquers the east. And these directions correlate to the region that these generals are sent to quote-unquote conquer or defeat the enemy. And this is the second sub-tier within tier 2. And obviously, you don't have to have 4 generals in these positions at all times. If, let's say, the north is very peaceful, there's no nomadic tribes invading, you might never have a general who conquers the north. But if you have a situation that arises, you might name someone to take that spot. So these are temporary positions, much like most of the position here. There's a few that's always there, but we'll talk about that once again when we get into more detail about each one of these. And below this tier of generals who conquers, you have 4 generals who defends. And once again, they correlate to the 4 cardinal directions. So you have generals who defend the north, general who defends the south, general who defend the west, and general who defends the east. And once again, these positions are also not always taken, and they would arise whenever needed. And the difference between them and general who conquer is that it's just a lower tier ranking. You get lower salary, and you be lower ranked corresponding to some civil position on the other side. So depending on how much the court wants to pay you or how much honor they want to bestow on you, they might name you General who conquers or General who defends, but technically it's just a name change. It doesn't really make a huge difference. If there's no one ranked above you, you're still the highest rank in that situation. So let's look at each one of these positions in detail, starting with General of the Cavalry or 骠骑将军. So 骠骑将军 here is a position that was founded early on during the Han Dynasty, during the Western Han Dynasty, when cavalry was first kind of introduced into the Han military structure, because previously chariots was the king of the battlefield, but as the Han army did battle with the nomadic tribes, particularly the Xiongnu, they found out the strength of cavalry units, and they started to systematically raise horses and arm the army with cavalry. And cavalry tended to be a higher tier unit in the military. Therefore, general of the cavalry became the highest tier general. Now, it doesn't mean this general only commands cavalries. It just means they use the term cavalry in the naming. They would command the whole army or anyone who is ranked lower than them. This naming terminology just simply reflects the fact that cavalries became ranked higher than chariots on the battlefield. Therefore, general of the cavalry is ranked higher than general of the chariots. And some of the more famous characters from this period who had this role included Cao Hong, Sima Yi, Ma Chao, and Li Yan. The first two being Wei officers and the second two being Shu Han officers. And these two Shu Han officers were both named after Liu Bei declared himself emperor. So you can see here, once again, Liu Bei kind of, respected the customs. If he wasn't the emperor and was just the Duke of Hanzhong, he wouldn't be naming these high tier generals that only the emperor could name. So that's why Ma Chao and Li Yan are later generation officers who are more active in the later periods of the Three Kingdoms. Now, obviously, Ma Chao had this title first, but he died quite young of natural causes, and Li Yan took over after him. Now, many of you might not know Li Yan very well, since the later periods of the Three Kingdoms is kind of murky for a lot of people, but we'll get to other lore series in the future where we'll talk about him. He's quite important here. And on the Wei side, you have Cao Hong, who's a relative of Cao Cao, very trusted. And later on, once that generation got old, Sima Yi came into power and had a bunch of these positions. And this is the second time we've seen Sima Yi on the list. And that's common because he might have been named General of the Cavalry one time when he was on par with the three Grand Excellencies. And then later on, when he had more control or he was more valued, he was given the position of Grand General, where he was ranked above the three Excellencies. But in both cases, he was the highest ranking general in the Wei forces. Moving on, we have General of the Chariot, or 车骑将军. And this position was held by a lot of generals, as this was the more common position that was given out during this time period. Now, once again, doesn't mean this position's rank lower. It doesn't mean there's a grand general and a general of the cavalry ranked above you. Those positions often would be empty positions, and the emperor could just come out and name you general of the chariot, and you automatically be the highest ranked military officer in that position. Or sometimes many of these generals who are general of the chariot named it themselves. They basically were a regional warlord and they felt comfortable naming themselves general of the chariot. So that's why we see characters like Li Jue, Dong Cheng, and Yuan Tan with this position. So Li Jue got this position after Dong Zhuo's death, and he kind of bestowed this on himself as he took over as quote-unquote regent for a short time after the civil war that pushed Lu Bu out. And that's probably why he got the unique model over Guo Si, because he had this high rank. So he was kind of in the leadership position, even though historically he and Guo Si kind of shared power. The second person here, Dong Cheng, is a character that's not related to Dong Zhuo at all. Dong Cheng got his position because his daughter married Liu Xie. So he was kind of the in-law to the puppet emperor. And he led this assassination attempt that failed terribly against Cao Cao that caused his death ultimately. But during the time where he was the in-law to the emperor out of respect gave him a title that made him the general of the chariot, even though he doesn't have any command over the real military, since Cao Cao had full control of that, and Cao Cao named himself the grand general to be ranked above Dong Cheng. So he was kind of just a figurehead there with a title to give him more status as his daughter married Liu Xie. Next up, we have Yuan Tan. So Yuan Tan here gave himself this title after he took over the Qing province, which is the Shandong Peninsula area that he took over from, where Kongrong is in the map. This is when his father was really strong in the north, and he just wanted to give himself some significance here. So nothing too crazy with these three. And in terms of the more Three Kingdoms related characters that had this title, we have Zhang He, who held this title under Cao Cao, and Cheng Yu, who also held this title under Cao Cao. And then under Liu Bei, you had Zhang Fei and Xiahou Ba. Now, Zhang Fei held this title after Liu Bei became emperor, and Xiahou Ba was super later on when Sima clan kind of took over in Wei. Xiahou Ba, who is the son of Xiahou Yuan, defected to Shu Han and joined them there, where he was given the position of general of the chariot. So it's a quite interesting case here. Now you might have noticed so far in our list that Sun Quan or Wu basically don't have any generals in our list. They actually do have one person who had all these positions, and that person's name is Zhu Ran, but he was also active much later on, simply because Sun Quan was the last faction to make himself emperor, and also Sun Quan wanted to do something different, so he had all these different titles made up, and it's kind of hard to piece them in with how the structure of the later Han period was named. As you can see that Cao Cao kind of took over as regent, and the Wei kingdom followed largely Han customs, and Liu Bei, who also wanted to make his kingdom the continuation of the Han dynasty, also follow these Han customs. So they kind of have a similar match to what was active in terms of titles throughout the Eastern Han dynasty. So that's why it's easier to find people with the same titles from these two factions versus Sun Quan's faction. And then after these two generals of the cavalry and the chariot, we have general who protects, or Wei Jiangjun. This is a very special position. Out of all the tier 2s, this position is the most well defined and not often empty. General who protects is responsible for the defense of the imperial capital. So their job is to control all the armed forces in the capital, whether it's city guard, palace guard, or various armed forces that exist in the capital. They're the ones who has to defend the safety of the capital. And we have two generals who held this position. For the Shu Han kingdom, you had Zhuge Zhan, who is the son of Zhuge Liang. And for Wei, you had Cao Hong, who once again we said is a relative of Cao Cao. So you see here, only like the most trusted generals tend to hold this position. And we've seen Cao Hong on the list before. And basically what happened is that he had this position as general who protects, and he got a promotion into the general of the cavalry. So the position of general of cavalry, general of chariot, and general who protect is kind of the rank within this sub-tier. So he was the lowest rank in this sub-tier, although super high rank overall in the grand scheme of things. He got a promotion into the general of the cavalry from this point on. So moving on from this sub-tier, you move into the next sub-tier of generals who conquers. And here we have more of a cardinal direction, and there's different time periods when these were named. And these titles were kind of given out in this situation as a bribe for peace with Ma Teng and Han Sui. So in the year 202, these two, former Liang rebels kind of negotiated a deal with Cao Cao, where they got, a general position, and they kind of became semi-vassal states. Ma Teng basically went to Ye to kind of got an office job, even though he held this general title, and his men and land was given over to his son Ma Chao as part of this deal. And Ma Teng became the general who conquers the south, and Han Sui became the general who conquers the west. Now, although they're both in the western regions, they can't name both of them generals who conquers the west. So they had a compromise here. Han Sui, being the slightly more western force, got the title of west, and Ma Teng, being slightly south toward the Qiang territories and the Shuba region, got the title of general who conquers the south. Now, they don't conquer anything. It was just a title bestowed on them. And these titles, like I said before, like many of the titles here, are often empty. And that's how Ma Teng and Han Sui got their titles when they negotiated their peace with Cao Cao's faction. And aside from them, there's actually three other generals who held these positions under the reign of Cao Cao. And their positions more reflected the military nature of things. So first up, you have Xiahou Yuan, who is the general who conquers the west. Zhang Liao, the general who conquers the east, and Cao Ren, the general who conquers the south. So this is actually three different generals that were deployed to three different areas and defended the kingdom. And this is later on, 215 and beyond. Xiahou Yuan was the general who conquers the west, and he was responsible for defending the Hanzhong region. So this is the key choke that leads into Chang'an, and he held this position for quite long until 219, when he was slayed by Huang Zhong as Liu Bei attacked Hanzhong. Zhang Liao was the general who conquers the east. He was mainly responsible for defending the city of Hefei, which is around where Yangzhou is on the game map. And here he held Hefei and repelled multiple campaigns where Sun Quan tried to invade north of the Yangtze River. Cao Ren is the general who defends the south, and he defends the general area where the Jin province is. Now, the Jin province you might think Liu Bei had for a long time. Yes, Liu Bei had pieces of the Jin province. The northern part of the Jin province was held by Cao Cao after the defeat of Chibi. If you can recall from our Chibi lore series, when Cao Cao was defeated and retreating, Cao Ren was left behind to defend the northern commanderies of the Jin province, which were still under Cao Cao's control. And even in our recent lore series in the Nanman expedition, where we kind of recap the events, you realize when Guan Yu was assaulting north, Cao Ren was still defending there. And that's why he was the general who conquers the south, because he was kind of responsible for the southern front. Zhang Nao was kind of responsible for the eastern front, which still defended south because it goes east all the way to the sea, and then he's defending the eastern portion of the southern line. Xia Hoyuan was defending the western part of the Wei Empire. And once again, we only have Wei generals here because only the Wei had the Han Emperor. That's why only they can name these high-ranking generals. But don't worry, it doesn't mean the other faction didn't have cool general titles. They just didn't correspond to a higher rank. It was very interesting during this time period in the Three Kingdoms where many general titles were made up. So you have like fun names. Like, you've seen the titles in game where you have like the Flying Swallow. Similar idea. You end up creating these cool general names that, corresponded to whatever the general you're bestowing on, like a feat they did, and you kind of, create a name for them and a rank. And we're going to get into most of those later on in this series. But right now, we're just talking about the very standard top tier positions that were available throughout the Han Dynasty. And that's why it's mainly Wei generals. And finally, we have the lowest sub-tier in the tier 2. And here we have generals who defends, or the 四镇将军. So you have 镇南, 镇北, 镇东, 镇西, or defending the north, defending the south, defending the east, defending the west. And here you have 3 more faces that's quite familiar. Cao Cao was named by the Han government for 镇东将军, or the general who defends the east, as he had kind of a semi-eastern position in Chen and Xuzhou later on. Liu Biao was given the title by the emperor, the general who defends the south, as he had Jinzhou as the governor, and he kind of defended that southern portion of the empire. And Han Sui was the general who defends the west. No surprise. And you shouldn't be surprised that Han Sui shows up a lot. He was the more dominant general and more significant historical general out west between him and Ma Teng, even though Ma Teng ends up playable in tons of games, including Total War Three Kingdoms, simply because Ma Teng had a much more famous and better son in Ma Chao. And if you want to highlight Ma Chao, you have to make his dad a more significant and playable character, or else Ma Chao would not be available. So that's pretty much it for Tier 1 and Tier 2. These positions are more overarching. Outside of General Who Protects, which had a more defined role, these were just titles you gave generals. And the directional ones were more interesting simply because they corresponded to where they were defending. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. We're going to break it down to Tier 3 next. Things get more complicated as you go down in tier, as you could get more creative with those titles. So we're going to be covering this in a similar format where we talk about, who held these positions, what kind of circumstance they were in when they held these positions, and hope you guys can enjoy this series. So see you guys next time. Bye.